Excellent. All right. So good to see folks. Welcome to Civic Well's fall webinar series. My name is Bernadette Austin. I'm the Chief Executive Officer here. So thrilled that you're able to join us. I'm very excited about today's topic. So just so you know where you are today, we are talking about CEQA reform. How will the 2025 legislative reforms to CEQA and other laws affect my community? We're thrilled to have you here. In a moment, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator today, Eric DeCock, and he'll be introducing our speakers. But just a few friendly reminders. First, please use the chat and/or Q&A functions at the bottom of your screen. So if you're not familiar, you can look for the chat function that looks like a dialog box. Q&A is a box with a square with a question mark in it. And if you don't see that, you can select the circle with 3 dots in it for more and find chat or Q&A. Our panelists will be responding throughout the presentation. We will also have some time towards the end, but because we have such high attendance and this is such an important topic, I want to make sure that we are able to address as many questions as possible. When I'm done speaking, I'll share with you that not only are we excited about this topic, we also have a great topic next week where we will be talking about the Cap and Now Invest program. And so with that, I will turn it over to Eric DeCock with Ascent.
Thanks so much, Bernadette. Good to see you and welcome everyone to this exciting webinar we put on for you today. Next slide, please. Yeah, so my name is Eric DeCock. I'm the Director of Interdisciplinary Planning at Ascent. I'm joined today by Greta Brownlow, my colleague in Ascent, who's the Director of our Northern California Environmental Practice. Chad Beckstrom, also with Ascent, is here today, who's a principal and our Southern California Environmental Practice Leader. And we're very pleased to also be joined by Ali Pazeshkapur, the City of Santa Ana's Planning and Building Agency Executive Director. So thanks so much, Ali, for taking the time to join the conversation today. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about CEQA reform, but there were 2 key bills that maybe many of you have heard about, Assembly Bill 130 and Senate Bill 131, also affectionately known by some as the trailer bills that were signed in the middle of the year this year. And those trailer bills, the term, of course, means, for those that know the legislative parlance, that these bills were attached to the budget bill when it was signed into law. And these bills did have an effective date of July 1st of this year, with a few key exceptions. But the 3 main really big things that these bills did is, first of all, CEQA modernization. We'll be talking about a lot of that piece of the package today in terms of what were the new exemptions or other CEQA streamlining provisions that were in the bills. There were also quite a few planning and zoning law amendments, especially in Assembly Bill 130, that did modify some of the statutory requirements around the regional housing needs allocation, or the RHNA process, as RHNA, as you see on the screen, housing elements and other housing-related policy changes. The bills also did modify, especially AB 130 did modify the residential building code, the law governing that code. It does omit the next triennial code update that was scheduled to go into effect in a few years, and it does limit local authority on the adoption of what are known as REACH codes. So for those that are working in the energy or the building permitting space, those provisions are quite important as well. But we'll mostly be focusing on CEQA today, and so I just wanted to make that clear. Next slide, please. So what is the state really trying to achieve with these bills, right? I mean, there's a lot of kind of goals that were stated in some of the messaging that went out in press releases and so forth when these bills were signed into law. But of course, the number one goal, of course, was to accelerate housing production and again, sort of remove some of the procedural or regulatory barriers that exist in the law, increasing regulatory certainty for projects, institutionalizing sort of overarching key policy housing reforms in the policy space. And of course, some of these reforms are also really intended to support more infrastructure, making the infrastructure we have work better for us, to build the things we want, like parks and trails, economic development, manufacturing, clean manufacturing, and of course, increasing wildfire resilience. And so some of the provisions, and especially in SB 131, do advance some of the ongoing work that's been going on from the administration and the legislature to sort of streamline the work we need to do to build wildfire resilience, both in the landscape and in communities. A big question on the table today, of course, also is what are the opportunities and challenges for local communities? Will these reforms really work as intended? What are some of the mechanics around some of the provisions? Are there any gaps or issues that we need to be aware of and how some of these provisions could be applied in practice? So we'll be digging into those questions today. We also want to acknowledge that maybe not everyone in the world is excited about some of the work to streamline the process, and there is some maybe concern by some folks on the webinar today about kind of circumventing the public process and what that means for communities and what that means for the public's interest. So we want to acknowledge that some of those issues may be present today and that there's obviously some trade-offs that we need to think about, and maybe we'll be touching on that a little bit as we go through what the bill provisions are today. Next slide, please. So again, we're really focusing, just to kind of cement the agenda today, we're really focusing mostly on CEQA today. We're not going to be doing an exhaustive summary discussion of every provision in AB 130 and SB 131. We would need hours to do that, even just at a high level. So just know that we're really focusing on some of the key aspects. I do want to highlight, however, for those of you who already may be on a Sense mailing list and do get our Sense Share e-newsletters in your email boxes from time to time, that we did start publishing newsletters and a series on these bills. And if we go to the next slide, we do see that there's a graphic on the screen here. You can get access to 4 of the issues that we've published to date in our Ascent Trailer Bills Deep Dives newsletter series. We've done ones on things like the residential reach code moratorium, the new residential infill exemption, which we'll be covering today, and other key CEQA topics that we'll also be covering in the webinar today. We do have a few more issues in process and teed up, so expect more articles to come out from Ascent through that series. And again, the website, the URL is shown in orange on the second bullet point here on the screen. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Greta, who's going to help us do the first deep dive on urban infill exemptions. That's all yours, Greta.
Great. Excuse me. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about AB 130, which is, again, an urban infill exemption for housing projects. And there's an exciting one because it's a statutory exemption as opposed to a categorical exemption, which means that it's not subject to exceptions. And if you qualify, for all of the requirements established by the law, then you are good to go to use this exemption. Next slide, please. The next couple slides are about eligibility, what types of projects actually are eligible to use this statutory exemption. So again, as Eric mentioned, we're trying to promote housing development here. So this applies for housing projects. It ups the size of the minimum site requirement from, say, what a class 32 infill exemption has done for us to 20 acres, though it maintains that 5-acre eligibility requirement for builder's remedy projects. Also, with regard to site qualifications, it has to be urbanized, so previously developed and have most of the perimeter of the site surrounded by urban uses, and it needs to be within incorporated municipality or a U.S. Census urban area, and needs to be consistent with the jurisdiction's existing general plan and zoning designations. Next slide, please. Some additional eligibility requirements. So this is not meant for things like transient housing, so not hotels and motels and things like that. It also does have a density requirement of at least 50% of the housing element default density. And as with some other exemptions, you are not able to use this exemption if you're demolishing a historic structure. And the designation of such a structure needs to be in place before the preliminary application for a project. And this last bullet here is just noting where this is codified in the Public Resources Code. Thanks. Next slide. So the legislation also points to some requirements established by SB 35 with the government code where that is codified at the bottom of the slide here. But so basically, if there's certain environmentally sensitive conditions on site, you also are not qualified to use this exemption. That includes certain areas of coastal zones, things like prime farmland, wetlands, habitat for protected species, and the like. There are certain environmental site conditions that can be mitigated and allow the use of this exemption still. And those would include things like very high fire hazard zones, hazmat sites, being within an earthquake zone or a flood hazard zone, for instance. Next slide, please. Some additional qualifications. There are no labor requirements except for projects that are 100% low income projects, or for buildings proposed at heights greater than 85 feet. This also includes some required mitigation for projects that are within proximity of a freeway. So there's some air quality mitigation requirements like HVAC requirements and the like. Projects that are going forward under AB 130 also have to complete at least a phase 1 environmental site assessment. And then after that, if a phase 2 is needed or any additional remediation must be completed. And then there's also certain requirements for tribal consultation that they're important to note. And then the following slides, I'll get into that a little bit in more detail. Excuse me. So yeah, the AB 130 actually has a bit to say about tribal consultation requirements, and it's a little bit of a deviation from, say, or an improvement, I guess I should say, from what's established under AB 52. So this outlines the basic requirements. When you do the math, it adds up to about 133 days within which consultation must be completed. So this law establishes that local governments have to offer consultation to tribes within 14 days of having an application deemed complete. And then it imposes, importantly, a 30-day timeline for agencies to act. So to approve or disapprove a qualifying project, which commences when tribal consultation process is complete. So kind of the important thing to say about this, I think, is that at the conclusion of the time frame, the agency has this 30 days as a deadline to act, and this newly created deadline to act on an application is a pretty significant departure from, say, the current Permit Streamlining Act requirements, which impose a duty upon an agency to act only once the agency actually agrees that CEQA review is complete, and so that could leave projects kind of in CEQA limbo if it's up to the agency rather than an established timeline to determine when that consultation is complete. Next slide, please. So just a couple takeaways. Obviously, in addition to that important establishment of a firm timeline, the legislation does require that consultation be meaningful, despite not requiring that an actual agreement be reached. And again, it does have a bit to say on what this means, and so it's worth looking at the actual language. But the intent overall is really to provide clearer rules than, say, AB 52, which applies to initial studies and EIRs as to when consultation is completed. Next slide, please. Well, I guess I'm going to chat now. Yeah.
Yeah. So over the years, there have been several other attempts at really fast tracking and incentivizing approvals that reduce CEQA reviews for housing projects. But some of those have fallen a bit short. To name a few, there's the Class 32 categorical exemption for infill projects, the infill exemption in Section 15195, the 15183 community plan zoning exemption, and SB 35 ministerial process. AB 130 exemption is a full statutory exemption, as Greta said. So it eliminates environmental review requirements entirely for qualifying projects, unlike some of the other streamlining processes. It's also more specific, it's narrow, defined compared to categorical exemptions that are more general in nature. And this exemption offers much broader applicability and covers a much wider range of projects than some of the previous tools. For instance, there are no caps on the number of units. There's no proximity to transit required. It allows for much larger sites, up to 20 acres, compared to like 5 or 4 acres for previous provisions. There's no affordability or labor requirements for most projects. And this exemption really simplifies the criteria. It eliminates many of the limiting requirements that made some of the previous exemptions impractical by eliminating the exceptions that apply to categorical exemptions. It includes fewer and less restrictive environmental criteria and provides clearer, more objective standards. Next slide. Next slide, please. So with these changes, we'll likely see more exemptions and fewer neg decks and EIRs, which, were sometimes required when a project just narrowly missed the exemption requirements, which we're going to talk more about later when we get to SB 131. Most infill projects that comply with general plans or zoning that fit within a 20-acre urban setting will likely now be exempt from CEQA. We think planning reviews will be limited to verifying compliance with objective design standards. And with reduced CEQA document requirements, processing times will likely be significantly shortened from a minimum of 6 months to a year or more to a matter of weeks or months. Now, while this exemption does eliminate full CEQA review, documentation for consistency with the criteria should still be done. Next slide. So as a best practice, we feel it's really important to show your work and how you substantiate your conclusions. So Ascent has developed this decision-making framework checklist that you can use to help determine whether a project qualifies for this exemption, along with some useful links to resources. And this can be found at the link here on this page, as well as the one Eric showed earlier, along with the full article that we published on our website about this exemption. Next slide.
So we have a couple of examples here just to give folks an idea of, what types of projects may or may not qualify to use this exemption. This particular one is a hypothetical project in the city of San Jose. It's clearly a residential project. So meeting the intent of the exemption, proposing about 1,000 residential units. It is within a designated downtown commercial zone that allows residential. So it would qualify as being consistent with general plan zoning. It's located on a 5-acre site within a developed area. So again, seeming to meet the requirements of AB 130. It's not within 500 feet of a freeway, so wouldn't have to meet those additional mitigation requirements, but it does appear, with this amount of information that this would qualify to use the AB 130 exemption. So kind of the next steps would be preparing that required phase 1 ESA to determine next steps with regard to any hazardous materials remediation, and then beginning tribal consultation once that project application is deemed complete. Next slide. Another example, this one located in West Sacramento, again, a residential project of up to 150 units. This one also would appear to be consistent with general plan zoning requirements. It's within a designated medium density residential area and does meet the size requirements. However, this is actually in kind of a suburban area. And as you can sort of see on the slide here, it's not, doesn't appear to be 75% surrounded by urban uses. So our assessment, again, knowing a limited amount of information, would be that this would actually not qualify for this exemption. Next slide.
Okay, we're going to move on to VMT real quick. Next slide, please. So ever since VMT was introduced as the standard for transportation analysis, analyzing VMT has been challenging, to say the least, and many have been advocating for reform or elimination of the standard, really just due to the difficulty in evaluating VMT and enforcing reductions on a project-by-project basis. Well, it seems like VMT is here to stay, at least for now, because AB 130 reinforced the standard for transportation analysis and includes new mitigation options to facilitate the development of VMT affordable housing or related infrastructure. Next slide, please. So AB 130 creates an option that allows agencies to mitigate VMT impacts by helping to fund these types of affordable housing or infrastructure projects. So it includes contributions to the state's Transit-Oriented Development Implementation Fund. How much funding would mitigate the impact? Nobody really knows yet. The State Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation is required to issue initial guidance by July 1, 2026, and update it every 3 years. It should be pointed out that this is just one option. It's not mandatory, and lead agencies are free to impose other mitigation measures as well. Next slide. So AB 130 establishes some limited guidance on how funding will be prioritized. So the Department of Housing and Community Development is to allow deposits to be made into this, this fund beginning July 1, 2026, which is also the same time that LCI's guidance is due. And it would fund projects in the following priority order here. So first priority goes to projects in location efficient areas within the same region as a project. Second priority to projects within the same region as a project. And third priority to projects in location efficient areas that are outside of the originating region, but within an adjacent area. So LCI's guidance is supposed to define what location efficient areas mean and reflect a reasonable nexus between where the impact occurs and the location of the project to be funded as mitigation. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're moving on to this near miss provision in SB 131. So prior to SB 131, there was there was a sort of all or nothing approach, a one strike and you're out. And so many deserving projects that were similar to other exempt projects would require a full neg deck or an EIR. So under SB 131, if a project would qualify for CEQA exemption, but for a single condition of that exemption, CEQA review is limited to the environmental effects caused by that single condition. And what is defined as a condition is a physical or regulatory feature of the project, or its setting or an effect upon the environment caused by the project. Next slide, please. So this provision does not apply to projects that are not similar in kind to projects that typically qualify for an exemption, or projects that fail to satisfy two or more exemption conditions. But also specifically, it does not apply to residential projects that also include warehouse distribution centers, oil and gas infrastructure facilities, or projects located on natural and protected lands. And this fourth provision was added later, where projects on parcels exceeding 4 acres that are either builder's remedy projects or very low or moderate income, or emergency shelter projects that are inconsistent with the general plan and zoning, where a jurisdiction has a compliant housing element. Next slide. So these conditions fall into a few different categories here. Size and scale exceedances may represent projects that exceed the unit limitations, or perhaps you have a class 32 infill project on a site that exceeds 5 acres. You have regulatory inconsistencies, which may include projects that are inconsistent with the general plan or have non-conforming zoning. Projects may trigger environmental thresholds, such as sites with sensitive biological resources or historic resources, or projects listed on hazardous waste sites, for instance. And then there are other eligibility limitations. So that could include projects that don't meet affordability requirements or labor standards. But I think, there's still sort of several questions and uncertainties as to how this may be interpreted and applied, which we'll cover in a bit here. So if your project does meet the eligibility requirements, it does not trigger any of those exceptions, you may move on to a focus CEQA review. So that could be an initial study, neg deck, or EIR. And the document only needs to address that single condition that makes the project ineligible for exemption. And as part of this, you're also not required to evaluate alternatives or growth-inducing impacts. The other thing SB 131 does, it attempts to facilitate a more efficient project planning and review by allowing applicants to request a pre-filing consultation to discuss the scope of analysis and help expedite the environmental review process. Next slide.
So a bunch of words on this slide, apologies for that, but the idea is to get across that there are still some kind of uncertainties with regard to how this is going to be implemented. Folks are really quite excited about this potential streamlining mechanism for CEQA, and as well as AB 130, as we've described. But you really do still have to kind of weigh your options of using SB 131 versus other existing streamlining pathways for CEQA. So this, one example is, one we were approached about a project recently where it seemingly would, clearly qualify as a near miss for say qualifying for AB 130, a housing project on a site that, but for a stream running through the site, which would be considered a sensitive habitat pursuant to the language of SB 35. That could probably qualify, and you may choose to do a single issue mitigated negative declaration, or EIR, for instance. But there's the other possibilities that if this was consistent with a general plan or a community plan, you could also just choose to do something like a section 15183 of the CEQA guidelines analysis, which allows you to look at, analyze just the impacts peculiars of the project, and discuss, that the project was kind of already within the scope of the general plan EIR. So, there's still some, again, weighing to be done in terms of what your already existing options are versus the merits of using this CEQA streamlining mechanism. The other thing is that, the language of the legislation talks about, the near miss is basically missing a single condition within an exemption. And, the single condition is not terribly well defined. The most readily applicable disqualifying condition would probably be a physical condition, like, for instance, the stream running through a project site that I mentioned. That's kind of obvious. That's a single issue that would disqualify you from using a certain exemption. So you might move on to just do an environmental review that just focuses on that one single condition. But it's a little more difficult to figure out what the scope of your analysis might be if you're talking about, a disqualifier that is the exceedance of the site size or the number of units. Like, how would you go about analyzing that in a single issue environmental document? Similarly, if you're contributing to a cumulative impact, or if your project is not fully surrounded by urbanized uses, how do you actually go about sort of framing your analysis in a single issue document that utilizes this streamlining mechanism? The other similar consideration or uncertainty is around, I mentioned earlier that for AB 130, one of the qualifying requirements is that it's not your site isn't on environmentally sensitive land as defined in the language of SB 35. However, that language kind of mentions a slew of conditions. So are you looking to at a series of site characteristics that you now need to focus on, or is it really referring to kind of one of those characteristics as the single issue? So again, there's a little bit of lack of clarity there, and just some things to think through when you're considering, what your disqualifying condition is and how you would go ahead and address that in a single issue analysis. Next slide. This slide is just highlighting some best practices for implementing this. I may have gotten to some of this in discussing the uncertainties, but it's good to, obviously, for any new legislation that you're trying to utilize, any new exemption, develop standardized procedures, consulting, conducting consultation between agency and applicant early in the process. Things like creating templates, which can seem kind of mundane, but can be really important for standardizing your process and making it clear, what projects would qualify and how you would proceed, how you would structure your documentation that makes things easier for, if you're a public agency, makes things easier for your staff and for your consultants alike. Next slide.
Okay, next slide. We're just going to touch on housing element really quick here. So housing element law currently requires local governments to identify sites that must be upzoned to meet the RENA, and then upzone the sites as promised within 1 to 3 years from the certification of the housing element, depending on the specific circumstances. Move on to the next slide, please. So SB 131 exempts CEQA rezonings that implement the housing element commitments. So as part of the housing element, agencies normally should have adopted a CEQA document. However, we know of several agencies that have exempted their housing element, essentially kicking the can down the road to the rezoning. So question, I think, in our mind is, does this give those agencies an out of having to do CEQA in the rezoning? SB 131 does not indicate that rezoning can be exempt only if an EIR or NECDEC have been certified or adopted for the housing element. So perhaps, we'll get more clarification on that through cleanup in the legislation or through the courts. Next slide, please. Next. So just quickly, just wanted to I'm not going to run through these, but just wanted to let you all know that SB 131 includes exemptions for several other types of projects here. So this is just a simplified list, but just keep in mind that there are certain requirements and exceptions to each of these. So you'll want to, if you have a project that you think fits one of these exemptions, dig into the legislation in a bit more detail. Next slide. And then finally, we'll talk about just a couple of other changes. So SB 131 limits the scope of the CEQA admin record. It really attempts to minimize the burden on agencies and CEQA litigants to reduce the costly process that delays resolution in the courts. So the SB 131 clarifies that the admin record needs only to include internal agency communications that were actually presented to the final decision-making body or were reviewed by other high-ranking agency executives or supervising officials. Additionally, it clarifies that drafts of any environmental documents that were not previously released for public review don't need to be included in the record. And then finally here, SB 131 requires that infill guidance be updated at least every 2 years. And the purpose is to really better incentivize affordable and infill housing, address any rigidity, lack of clarity, and potential for frivolous litigation to make these provisions more effective. So the trend here seems to be towards more CEQA reform and streamlining. Next slide. So I'll hand it off to Ali.
Thanks, Chad. So I'm Ali, Executive Director of the Planning and Building Agency for City of Santa Ana. And I just wanted to start off by sharing a little bit about the community that I serve. So we are the county seat. We're about 27.4 square miles and about 310,000 population. We're served by multiple freeways that cross through the city, as well as trains, Amtrak, and Metrolink. And in 2026, Orange County's first light rail will be active. That's the OC streetcar, which will connect our train station all the way out to our city limit with the city of Garden Grove. Virtually every vacant or underutilized lot is considered an infill site in Santa Ana for development purposes. You can see from this image below, we are largely built out city. Some other fun facts, we are America's 4th or 5th largest densest city, depending on how you measure it. So for comparison, 27 square miles is also the size of neighboring city of Orange. They've got about 110,000 people. We are the same square miles with triple that population. And we're home to a wide variety of development types. So there's low-rise development, there's high-rise development down by the airport, there's commercial, there's industrial, there's million-dollar historic neighborhoods, there's neighborhoods with a lot of economic distress, major cultural institutions like the Bowers Museum and Discovery Cube. And we even have a river that's been concreted over, but nonetheless, that flows through our city, the Santa Ana River. Next slide. So in looking at AB 130 and SB 131, from my perspective, I'm always asking, how could any of this new legislation that comes down the pike and is signed into law every year benefit us or in some ways not be beneficial to our jurisdiction? As we were talking about earlier, a lot of recent exemptions on streamlining have shown mixed results. They either included, and I'm going to use very broad terms for streamlining, whether they were CEQA streamlining or like land use planning streamlining, but some of them, for example, contain provisions back in the day requiring an affordable or a rental component. Others talked about labor, prevailing wage. And so it begs the question, how is the impact of a project for the sake of CEQA any different if a project is condo versus rental, if it's built with skilled and trained labor versus not, if it's affordable versus market rate? These are the questions that we're always asking ourselves as municipal planners. And oftentimes we ask ourselves when we go to legislative updates as well, these sessions at APA and whatnot, to learn more about, again, are these bills actually going to produce results in our community, whether it's through development or produce results through changing the way we actually implement planning at the local level? I think one thing to keep in mind overall from a housing perspective is that studies have shown repeatedly that ADUs remain by far the most common form of housing development still going on in the state. About 20% of all housing being built statewide is in the form of an ADU. So we would always benefit from asking ourselves, why is that? Why is the ADU the easiest, the most frequent? What is it about the ADU that makes developers turn to it as opposed to larger infill projects? And I think those are questions worth asking every time, again, a bill like AB 130 or SB 131 comes down the pike. Just to give a little bit more flavor about the city of Santa Ana and how we approach CEQA. So we're not a jurisdiction that necessarily has a philosophical position on CEQA. I know some cities, for example, will, out of an abundance of caution, remand everything as much as they can to like EIR level. In other cases, some cities are just like EIR phobic. They try to work with projects and developers to get them to avoid an EIR at any cost. In Santa Ana, again, whatever the environmental analysis shows is the CEQA document we'll go with, but we do often encourage developers to come in with self-streamlined or self-mitigating projects. And so whether it's an affordable housing development that's infill, that may be shy, by one hair of satisfying AB 130 or SB 131, or all the way down to other types of CEQA documents that might be required, we often encourage developers to really know the law, know CEQA, and come in with a project that doesn't turn us into the bad guy to say, hey, by the way, your project requires offsite mitigation, so therefore we're now in an MND territory, let's say. I'll give an example about how that went into practice a few years ago. A car wash was proposed along a major arterial in Santa Ana that was ultimately denied by the Planning Commission due to community concerns about impacts and noise and all that good stuff. The developer went quiet for about a year or two and then came back with a revised application that in many ways addressed what was shared at the public hearing about community concerns, but came in with a car wash and a traffic light as the application. So the project for a CEQA standpoint, at least, was literally to build a car wash and a traffic light. And as a result of that being the application, we found that there were no offsites required, that it actually was proactively addressing a concern, and the project now became categorically exempt. So it's an example of sort of working with a developer to know the law and see how you can come in with a project that's self-mitigating or self-satisfying of a lot of these streamlining measures. So if we can go to the next slide. I wanted to walk anyone who's listening through a couple of case studies in more detail in Santa Ana. So I've got about 3 or 4 that I'll go over. And again, we can ask ourselves, would these streamlining measures like AB 130 and SB 131 in retrospect have benefited a project if they had been in existence at the time, obviously. So the first is the Sexlinger Farmhouse and Orchard. So this is a 5-acre site at 1584 East Santa Clara Avenue. I'll show an aerial on the next slide so that you don't have to Google it while we talk. But the farmhouse itself was constructed in 1914, and the property contained about 250 old Valencia orange trees that were remaining by the year 2014, which is when the application was in full swing. The property itself was originally on the fringes of the city, but the city expanded its limits and annexed the property and surrounding neighborhoods in 1979. And from then all the way to when the application was submitted initially in 2010, it's always been residential. It's always been intended for R1 infill development. When the application first came through, due to an abundance of community opposition and input and concerns about the orchard and the farmhouse, the city actually placed the structure on the historic register proactively. So we have that ability in our municipal code. We took the project forward and the city council approved its being placed on the register. So now we had an application that was not only proposing demolition of a structure and the orchard to build homes, it was proposing demolition of an historic resource to develop the property. So as a result, the EIR was revised and recirculated 3 times to the public, and following multiple public hearings. So again, we're looking at the Historic Resources Commission, the City Council for just listing the property, then the Planning Commission meetings, the City Council meetings, multiple public hearings. But at the end, it was a 22-unit single-family development, and then the farmhouse was to have been restored into a 23rd home for sale on about a 1/4-acre lot. So a fun fact about this project, the opposition was immense at the beginning, to the point where even CNN had picked up the article or the story, because this was last remaining orchard in the city of Santa Ana, and of course in Orange County. It became synonymous with sort of like urban sprawl and sort of loss of history, loss of community character. That's how it was being kind of portrayed. But what's really interesting, if we can go to the next slide, is that what ultimately got built, you can see, is really no different than the characteristics of the existing neighborhood. So it's bounded on basically 3 sides by urbanized development, 4 if you count the park as being an urban development, or at least a city developed park. It wasn't fallow farmland, it wasn't open space, it's a city park. To the upper right is a cemetery, but you can see that basically what got built were those single family homes. Where the Google icon is, that's the historic farmhouse and a couple of the trees that were preserved. And even the roadway was laid out in a way to cut through or minimize cut through traffic. So what got built is totally in line with the existing development pattern. In fact, it probably benefited the existing community by realigning a roadway and minimizing cut through traffic. And yet what we got in the end was a project that seamlessly fits in to the community, despite all the hurdles of the historic listing and the EIR and the sort of entitlements that needed to go into this, and the sort of costly history. So if we can go on to the next slide. So one of the key provisions of AB 130 is it repeals the expiration provisions of the Housing Crisis Act. And one of those is that there's a limit on the number of public hearings. So the other is that we have to basically determine if the application at the time that it's submitted, if there's an historic resource at that time or not. We can't now go back and list a property as historic, and we can't put a developer through endless public hearings. The site was less than 20 acres in size, and again, surrounded arguably by urbanized uses. And like I said earlier, the farmhouse was not historic at the time the application was deemed complete. So in retrospect, again, without getting into too much detail, it's likely the developer could have benefited from the provisions of AB 130. Another fun fact about this project was that the original project would not have preserved the farmhouse and a few of the trees. It would have just completely demolished and replaced it with 24 homes total. But one of the EIR alternatives was that sort of historic preservation alternative, which ultimately got approved by the Planning Commission and the City Council. So again, it's an example of, yes, AB 130 could have helped in some ways the developer, but oddly enough, the EIR did contain an alternative that ultimately got approved. And it's really not that common that one of the project alternatives actually ends up being the approved and constructed project. So it's a lot to digest on this project with multiple lenses. If we can go on to the next slide. The next case study I'll touch on is Park on First. So this is a project that actually Chad helped us out with when he was working on this EIR with us. So this is a 9-acre site at 1660 East First Street. Again, I'll show an aerial. The project proposed 603 residential units in 2 buildings and 20,000 square feet of commercial space, plus open space, and a huge amount of street improvements to the roadway leading to the Santa Ana Zoo. The application was submitted to us in 2017, and it triggered the need for a general plan amendment and zone change to allow mixed use, high density development here. It was previously just a commercial zone and commercial general plan. So at the onset, we thought this would be eligible for an addendum to an existing EIR because there's an existing infill form-based mixed-use code area just across from this property that we thought if we just kind of enlarge the boundaries and spread the development capacity, all things were pointing to this could actually very well be an EIR addendum. But the technical studies came back. They all said, yay, addendum, yay, addendum, yay, addendum, except for the cultural resources study, which came back and said that the building that was there, which was the former home of the Santa Ana Elks Lodge, was eligible for preservation because of the history of the elks in the community. And because if you look closely at that bottom image, there's some concrete lattice work that is on there, that brise soleil, as it's called architecturally. And that was deemed to be eligible for preservation, in addition to some bar tiles inside the building. So we went from addendum to subsequent EIR. So if we can go on to the next slide. So this is an aerial of the property. It shows the two buildings, and it's right across from the Santa Ana Zoo. Again, arguably an urbanized use. It's not raw land, it's not undeveloped. And across the street are old motels. And then across the street on one side is a commercial development, more apartments to the west and south. So professionally, it could have very easily, in my opinion, qualified for urban infill development. And again, it's less than 20 acres in size. If we can go to the next slide. We dove into a little bit more detail on this one. So again, this is the near miss provision. All the technical studies were coming back saying EIR addendum, except for the historic eligibility of the building. And mind you, it was not on the register. It was just deemed to be eligible for preservation. So could it have been qualifying for streamlined processing? Possibly, right? Again, we have to go back and look in more detail, but it does beg the question, had these laws been in place, could this project have really gone through in a much more streamlined and less costly manner? The subsequent EIR resulted in a multifold increase in cost to the developer, in addition to the staff resources from our department that it took now to administer an EIR and the community outreach, and of course, lengthier review time. What's interesting about this, and again, I was kind of alluding to it with the Sexlinger project, is that ultimately the project was built. That's the first thing to digest. And then secondly, the public benefits from this project are enormous. There's multiple acres of new publicly accessible open space that's open to the public during daylight hours right across from the Santa Ana Zoo, 20,000 square feet of commercial, leasable commercial space, and a ton of new safety, roadway, landscape, pedestrian lighting, signage improvements on the main road leading along this project site to the Santa Ana Zoo. Even after the project was completed, we renamed the street like Zoo Lane to kind of celebrate the fact that it finally became a new entrance to the city's zoo at this location. So another fun fact about this project, going back to that cultural resources study. So when the building was being carefully dismantled to preserve those elements, some of the bar tiles were ultimately salvaged from the inside and made available to preservation groups. But that concrete lattice work that you might remember from the earlier image literally disintegrated and crumbled as it was being taken apart to be preserved. So all that, because of the lattice work, the bar tiles, and that lattice work ended up literally disintegrating as it was being dismantled because it was in such poor condition. I'll wrap up with two recent projects on the next slide. So anyone following development news in Santa Ana might have heard we recently adopted the general plan update in 2022, which opened the way for developments in key focus areas of the city, near South Coast being one of them. And down there, we zoned or designated the properties up to 125 units per acre in density, and basically floor area ratio of 5.0. So Related California came in and got entitled last year for a 41-acre redevelopment of a property down there with a new mixed-use community that triggered the need for a supplemental EIR. And then adjacent to that, the Segerstrom family owns property. They're the owners of South Coast Plaza, if anyone's familiar. The Segerstroms came in with a redevelopment of their adjacent 17-acre site with a smaller scale complementing project as well that needed, again, a supplemental EIR to the general plan updates program, final program level EIR. So the CEQA reviews for both projects came back. This is how good the initial general plan update EIR was, that literally, if you think 41 acres, 17 acres, all the demolition and hauling, all the construction activities, and the ongoing operational impacts of these projects, the technical studies came back and said for the related Bristol project, it boiled down to recreation and air quality impacts. Recreation, because the city has an aspirational goal of 3 acres of open space per 1,000 people, and this project wouldn't meet that. And air quality from temporary construction impacts. And then for the village project, it came down to recreation impacts as well, just because of the size and what I described earlier about not having the 3 per 1,000 being satisfied. So if we can go on to the next slide. These are the two project sites. So on the right, the larger portion is the related Bristol 41-acre site. And on the left, that square shape is the Sagerstrom Village site. So combined, we're looking at 58 acres of redevelopment, 5,500 plus units of residential, and over 450,000 square feet of commercial being built there, plus hotels and senior continuum of care. But if we can go to the next slide as I wrap up, we'll see the entitlement process for each one took about a year. There was a little bit extra beyond that because of development agreements that were proposed. So that's a completely different animal with negotiation and all that. But given the recency of AB 130 and SB 131, again, it's difficult to state with certainty because we'd have to go back and reevaluate these projects with these bills in mind. But arguably, it could be seen that the village-specific plan at under 20 acres with just the recreation impacts, to think that a project of that scale and size might have actually benefited from further streamlining, not just tearing off an EIR, but just some other sort of consistency analysis, is incredible to think how that could not just streamline things for developers, but also reduce the burdens on staff in terms of administration and management of the EIR process as projects come down the pike for us. So with that, we can go on. Sorry, I think that was it for me. So yeah, we can wrap it up with questions.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I just wanted to step in and let folks know, for those of us who are joining live, sincere apologies. We are having some technical difficulties. So I will note that the folks who have been able to join us are intrepid problem solvers, and I love that they're tuning into this CEQA, webinar. So if you are joining us by phone, you should be able to use *6 to mute and unmute. I also am able to allow folks to talk. So if folks want to try, let's try potentially 2 questions, and if that isn't successful, then we have some questions that we have prepared. But I'm going to highlight our speakers once again, and let's see. Does anyone who's calling in able to unmute and ask a question? Give them a minute to see if they can do that. All right, while they're doing that, I'm going to turn this back over to Eric, and he can provide, he's got some questions that he wanted to ask our speakers.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bernadette, and thanks for everyone for your patience today with some of the technical difficulties. I guess the first question I had, this might be more for Chad and Greta, but a lot of these exemptions, of course, are focused, especially the urban infill focus on urban areas for that exemption. But how will these bills implemented in different contexts? If we think about, more deeply suburban or even quite rural communities, are there any benefits or kind of caveats that we might give for folks working outside of urban environments?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think there's potential for, the VMT streamlining provisions or not streamlining, but mitigation provisions to help out. I know that's always been a source of frustration for jurisdictions that are more rural in nature and that are kind of going to always come up with a significant impact for related to VMT for a lot of projects that they choose to develop. So I think that could be beneficial. I mean, 130 doesn't really seem to, be of much assistance to projects in those environments, but potentially 131 could be. As we mentioned, you still have to go through the full process for whatever type of single issue environmental document you choose to prepare. With that streamlining mechanism. So it's still, there's still the full process of potential for public comment and noticing and all that good stuff, but it does cut down the work if you just have to focus on that one single issue.
Yeah, I agree with Greta there. I think also, the housing element streamlining would certainly benefit rural communities. So implementation of the housing element could potentially avoid additional CEQA needed there. And, SB 131 included a number of other exemptions that we didn't really dig into, but I think, things like agricultural housing, community water systems, linear broadband. There's a number of things there that a rural health clinic, for instance. So I think there are definitely some things here for more rural communities and suburban areas.
Great, thanks. Bernadette, do we have anybody teed up on the phone that wants to ask a question?
I do not see that. No, we can go on to our next internal question.
Okay. I guess, for the full panel, there's a lot in that we've unpacked. There's a lot we didn't even get to, but are there ideas floating out there for cleanup legislation or things we would want to fix? You might have hinted at some of this in your remarks today, but any kind of consensus or remarks folks have on how to make what happened this year even better or resolve some of the issues?
I think from the city standpoint, I'll just open by saying, having technical guidance memos from the state is always nice in the absence of just having to navigate these things because so many of these bills cross-reference each other, right? And then bill numbers come and go, but government code sections don't. So then, it's like to say, for example, a site as identified by SB 35, like that's going to be meaningless in 20 years to someone. And then, things like even if there's sunset provisions of certain elements of these bills, how does that relate? It really almost from a municipal standpoint would arguably be the responsibility of the state legislature to in these bills state, for example, like, and within 3 months, HCD shall put out like a technical guidance memo or a flow chart, or how do you interpret tribal notification processes, right? I think the only recent one that I've seen that comes close is SB 79, where it says basically within 90 days, the MPOs have to put out maps showing like basically where are these official transit, areas that are subject to SB 79. Like, yay, okay, having a map is beneficial. It's a starting point. But, for the planner at the municipal level, that's really just trying to do good, honest work. And at the same time, avoid mistakes that end up costing the city with like litigation, settlements, and stuff like that. I think, just there's a fiscal and almost like just like good planning sense that these bills should have some sort of requirement that there be technical memos coming out with them.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
I can add, we talked about this SB 131, this single condition can be really complicated, especially if it's not like one of the environmental conditions as far as the scope of analysis and how we analyze that. So certainly some better guidance or cleanup, I think, is warranted there. Um, from a CEQA practitioner's point of view, I don't want to see CEQA cut too much, but I definitely think there's room for more projects that make sense, right? That can be exempt or avoid, frivolous CEQA analysis. I think there's definitely room for these infill projects and these urban projects that really have no effect on the environment or very limited effects on the environment. Could find ways to make it easier for folks.
And I think if I could just add or uplift what you just said, Chad, a few years ago, I attended a workshop from the Rose Institute at one of the Claremont colleges, and Governor Davis was the moderator, and Cotty Petrie Norris and Buffy Wicks were there too as members of the legislature. And one thing that they touched on multiple times was we have to take ourselves back to like 1969, 1970, when freeways were being built through the Sierra Nevada and there was like rampant coastal development and just so much going on in the state during that boom and sprawl phase that we had for a couple of decades that's really what CEQA was originally intended in many ways to address. And then through court interpretations that it applied to like private developments. And then through subsequent add-ons, right, we have to at some point ask ourselves, like, why does a 24 unit infill residential project, or why does, a multi-story apartment complex that's no different than any others along the block really require that much resource, to be dedicated, forget cost, just like the resources it takes from a city standpoint to make sure you get it right, when my planners could be spending their time on just another project of much more fundamental character defining importance to the community. I think that's just a plug I would say for that sort of background and how we got to this point.
Yeah, I think that's such an important comment, Ali. I feel like on both sides, there's not just two sides, but on all sides, we could take a minute to appreciate, those who are trying to facilitate getting their development faster and are frustrated with CEQA to remember the original intent, but also for those of us who are, have our heads deep in, the mechanisms and the legislation and the exemptions, to remember that also the intent to get good projects built without having to go through, undue process.
Great, thanks so much.
Back
I
to
know
you.
that we're at time, and I wanted to really thank so much our wonderful speakers. This has been a really important topic. This is something near and dear to my heart, and I really apologize again for the technical challenges. So for those of you who are still listening in, we will be sharing the recording and the presentation on the webinar website, and sharing that out via our e-newsletter and social media. So we'll definitely get all of this wonderful information out to you in a useful fashion. So please join me in virtually thanking our experts today. It's really good to hear what the practical applications of CEQA can be for these communities that are impacted. So thank you so much.